Remember when I said I might do one of these a month? I forgot to mention I'm a bit of a slacker sometimes, so I apologise for the big gap between episodes 1 and 2, but nevertheless, it's time for episode 2, so let's talk about 5 more films that I love. Kicking off episode 2, I'm talking about Super 8, a wonderful love letter to the classic genre films of the 1980s, those Amblin, Steven Spielberg, sci-fi kind of genre films of the 1980s. This film does an incredible job of evoking the tones and the vibes of films like E.T. and Close Encounters and other films from that era, and it just really teleports you back to that different time of filmmaking. And I never got to experience films like E.T. or Close Encounters when I was a kid because I was born in 1997. But when this film came out in cinemas in 2011, me and my mum went to go see it, and I got to have that kind of experience as a 14-year-old kid in a cinema seeing this kind of film. So it was kind of a special cinema experience back then. All the kid actors do an incredible job. Joel Courtney, Elle Fanning, they're the heart and soul of the film, their relationship. It's really, really sweet, really endearing. I also like Kyle Chandler as the police officer, just trying to figure everything out, including what's going on in the town, and also his relationship with his son is quite strained after the death of the mother in the family. The train crash, by the way, remains one of the coolest things I've ever seen in a film. I watched the film about a month ago, and seeing that train crash again, it gave me chills because of just how big and grand it was. And some people complain that it's really over the top, and I understand that, but J.J. Abrams said that they made it so exaggerated because from the perspective of the kids, it would seem that way. So when you think about it in that way, per the perspective of the kids experiencing that train crash in first person, it would seem bigger and more crazy and surreal like that. So I think it works. And the score by Michael Giacchino, in my opinion, is one of his most underrated ever. The main theme, the main motif, the dun 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 dun, just fits like a glove into this kind of film, into this genre of film, and it really makes the film feel like it belongs in the era and amongst the other films that it pays homage to. Super 8 is one of my favourite films of the early 2010s, and it's easily my favourite J.J. Abrams film. And I want to see this J.J. Abrams come back and do a film because this is the only non-franchise film that J.J. Abrams has ever directed. Super 8 was the precursor to Stranger Things. If you love Stranger Things and you've never seen Super 8, watch Super 8, you will love it, I promise. The film also introduced me to ELO with its use of Don't Bring Me Down, and the only sin that this film commits is cutting off Don't Bring Me Down during the credits. Otherwise, it's great. If you're a long-time YouTube watcher or a Letterboxd reader of mine, you will know that I love and adore films about films, and Ed Wood is one of my absolute favourites in that subgenre. Similar to The Disaster Artist, another film about one of the worst directors of all time, it's an oddly inspiring film because Ed Wood is making these B films that are clearly so terrible and so bad, yet he continues to be determined and optimistic and passionate about filmmaking, and he carries on pursuing the dream of being a filmmaker and directing films, and you just can't help but like the character for that, and it just inspires you to keep going in whatever you're trying to do, because if he can carry on making films that are really terrible but still have some kind of career, then maybe you can as well. This might just be my favourite Tim Burton film of all time because he brings his usual quirkiness to it, but it's not overboard. It's just the right amount for this kind of story, and it works wonders. I love how it's in black and white. I love the time period. Johnny Depp, of course, is amazing in the film, as is everybody else. The musical score by Howard Shore is great, especially the opening credits music. It just sets the tone for the film perfectly. Interesting story, quirky execution, likeable main character, great acting, great directing, funny, oddly inspiring, great film about films, great film about Hollywood. In short, Ed Wood's a great film. You should watch it if you haven't already. Hidden gem is a term that I've not used a lot when describing films because I do watch a lot of fairly mainstream films, but this next film is the definition of an under-the-radar hidden gem in my eyes. It's a film called Patterson. Adam Driver plays Patterson, who is a bus driver in New Jersey who in his spare time writes poetry. That's the film. The beautiful thing about Patterson is that it celebrates the mundane average person. Like, Patterson himself is just a bus driver who writes poetry, and he doesn't do anything else. He goes home, he drinks beer, he hangs out with his wife, and it's just a really good look at average people. But it's also one of them films that I can easily see a lot of people saying it's super boring and nothing happens. I totally understand that. Like, I wouldn't tell my brother to watch this film because he would find this to be the most boring film ever made, ever. But for us civilized folk, we can sit back and appreciate what this film is trying to do in showing us average, everyday people just doing average, everyday things. And Patterson himself, when he's writing his poetry, he's just sitting on a park bench or sitting in the middle of a town square and observing his surroundings. He's just basic, everyday surroundings. People doing their thing, going to work, walking their dog or whatever. And Patterson manages to find beauty and joy in the most mundane of day-to-day activities. And he puts that into his poetry in just really well-written and moving kind of ways. And in a way, it just makes you want to sit back and appreciate all the smaller things in your life. Like I said, hidden gem. Let's go from a bus driver writing poetry to somebody trapped in outer space. Next film up is Gravity. Another subgenre that I love is space films, and Gravity is one of my favourite space films. And funnily enough, I was talking about how my brother would call Patterson super boring. My brother has seen Gravity. He saw it before I saw it, and he found it epically boring, and he was just slating the film to death. And it made me really curious to check it out even more because of how beloved it was by critics, by the Oscars. And I watched it, and I absolutely adored it because I loved it for all the reasons my brother said it was boring, because he said, oh, it's all quiet and there's no sound, and it just wasn't that entertaining. But I felt the complete opposite. The fact that there is no noise in space when Sandra Bullock's doing the spacewalk and when all the satellites are crashing into each other and blowing up made it all the more immersive, because that's how it would be in space. And also really creepy and eerie when all the satellites are crashing and blowing up and they're just making no sound. It's acting kind of like a silent killer and silent destruction and chaos. That is what I would call a very well-directed space film. And Sandra Bullock is, well, Sandra Bullock. She pulls you in, you're cheering for her to live through this unlivable situation. And just the premise in general is a really interesting one to watch. And again, the way they portray the no sound in space thing, the reason why a lot of people call this film boring is the reason why I think this film is really damn great and one of my favourite space films. And the last film for this episode is October Sky with Jake Gyllenhaal. This is the true story of Homer Hickam Jr., a teenager from a small mining town in West Virginia who is inspired by the launch of Sputnik to pursue a dream and a career of being a NASA engineer. This film is a perfect example of how a cliched, formulaic story can be overcome by amazing execution. You've seen a variation of this story in lots of films before, where somebody from a small town has big dreams, but because of who they are, where they come from, and their dad being a strict dad and wanting them to do something else with their lives, like stay in the family business or something, you know how it's going to unfold, more or less. But it's really the directing, the writing, and the acting of October Sky that makes you forget about all that stuff, because Jake Gyllenhaal is awesome. He's Jake Gyllenhaal, for God's sake. Even when he was young, he was awesome. And you just can't help be pulled in by this film's warmth. How this kid in this small town is just so optimistic in pursuing this dream of being a NASA engineer. And he and his friends are launching these little rockets in the local coal mines, and the town is surrounding and watching and cheering them on. It is some good, old-fashioned, inspirational storytelling at some of its very best. So that concludes this episode of Films I Love. What do you think about all 5 of the films I talked about in this episode? If you've seen them, that is. If you haven't seen them, change that very, very soon. You'll thank me later. Thanks for watching as always, and take it easy.